This is part 2 in our series entitled Behind the Door. A look at some of the events that have happened in Earth's history that have mystified people for centuries. This tape, we're going to be looking at the assassination of John Fitzgerald Kennedy. What really happened in Dealey Plaza, November 22, 1963? That will be the focus of this study in light of what is really going on behind the door. In our previous broadcast together, we did study on why the Titanic was sunk. There was a definite reason for it, and there was a definite power that was behind its sinking. In broadcasts after this, we're going to look at, in part 3 of Behind the Door, we're going to look at 3 U.S. presidents that were assassinated in a 25-year period. And in that same 25-year period, 2 other presidents were almost killed. One by poison and one by a train wreck. That's Behind the Door Part 3. Behind the Door Part 4, we're going to be taking a look at a most recent event in U.S. history, the greatest terrorist attack ever on United States soil. I'm talking about April 19th, 1995, in Oklahoma City. And in subsequent programs, we will then look at things like who was really behind the assassination of Abraham Lincoln and why. What was it? And who has it been throughout history over the last 450-odd years who has wanted to destroy every free government that has arisen in this earth? Those are just some of the things that we're going to be looking at in this series entitled Behind the Door. It was November 22, 1963. I was 6 years old. And I can still remember that Friday morning as our teacher told us that we had to go down to the cafeteria, which also served as our auditorium, because the principal had something he had to tell us. And as we made our way into that room, I remember it was a very solemn moment. And we all sat down, and the principal said, "Children, the President of the United States has just been shot." Now, being just 6 years old, I remember that I thought, wow, that's awful, but who was behind it? Why they would kill him? I had no idea. But I did know on that day that indeed the President of the United States had been shot. John F. Kennedy was shot in Dealey Plaza, downtown Dallas, November 22, 1963. He was in an open motorcade. It was Friday, 12:30 p.m. The crowds were cheering. There was a great scene of rejoicing as the President of the United States made his way through downtown Dallas. Everyone was smiling in those waving thousands, or at least it seemed that everyone was smiling. But in that time of rejoicing, shots rang out from the front, from behind, and John F. Kennedy, a short while later at the Memorial Hospital there in downtown Dallas, was said to be dead. Who would have shot John F. Kennedy? Of course, the Warren Commission has told us that it was done by Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone gunman who shot John F. Kennedy from behind, from the Dallas Book Depository building. Why would Oswald do it? Why would anyone shoot John F. Kennedy? Is it true that Lee Harvey Oswald was disgruntled at Kennedy's policies and he wanted to do Kennedy in? Was that the motive? Of course, 2 days after John F. Kennedy's death, many of those questions were snuffed out when Jack Ruby put a pistol into the rib section of Lee Harvey Oswald, and shortly after that, Lee Harvey Oswald also was dead. In order to get a clear picture as to who would have wanted John F. Kennedy dead, the greatest way to understand that is to analyze some things, some policies, some plans that had transpired prior to the assassination of John Kennedy, who might have been upset, and then after the assassination, who was going to be benefited by his death. There's no question that there were some very serious events that took place prior to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. Number one, of course, we find the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, in which the United States, led by the CIA, sought to go in and take over and drive out the radical communist leader by the name of Fidel Castro. There's no question that the United States wanted Castro out of Cuba. And so John F. Kennedy, with the help of the CIA, they were going to go in and oust Castro from power. But unfortunately, as the history books will tell us very, very clearly, the Bay of Pigs invasion failed. Fidel Castro was allowed to remain in Cuban control. What happened at the Bay of Pigs invasion? Why did it fail? Why did the mighty United States of America, led by the Central Intelligence Agency, how could they be defeated by some little tiny island nation in the Caribbean? I want to read to you from a book entitled JFK, the CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate John F. Kennedy. This is from page 154 of this book. The book is written by Colonel L. Fletcher Prouty, and this is page 154 of the Colonel's book. We read this: John F. Kennedy did fail in his attempt to gain full control of the CIA and its major partners in the Defense Department. It was the most crucial failure of his abbreviated presidency. He recognized his adversary during his first term, and as he related confidentially to intimate acquaintances, when I am re-elected, I am going to break that agency into 1,000 pieces. He meant to do it too, but the struggle cost him his life. You see, the CIA betrayed John F. Kennedy at the Bay of Pigs. They didn't carry out orders. They didn't carry out the plan to oust Fidel Castro. And so by so doing, they betrayed John F. Kennedy. And so as a result of the CIA's blowing that very crucial invasion of Cuba, John F. Kennedy, according to Fletcher Prouty's book, determined that when he was re-elected, he would break that agency into 1,000 pieces. There was something else that was going on prior to the assassination of John F. Kennedy. You see, John F. Kennedy wanted to get the United States out of Vietnam. We read again from a book entitled The CIA, Vietnam, and the Plot to Assassinate JFK. This is the same book by Fletcher Prouty. This is on page 264 of that book. We read this. There was a memorandum for the President. The subject was the report of McNamara and Taylor's mission to South Vietnam. With this report in hand, President Kennedy had what he wanted. It contained the essence of decisions he had to make. He had to get reelected to finish programs set in motion during his first term. He had to get Americans out of Vietnam. From the same book we read these words, same page, on November 22, 1963, the government of the United States was taken over by the superpower group that wanted an escalation of the warfare in Indochina and a continuing military buildup for generations to come. So we find that John F. Kennedy, once he was going to be reelected, which he felt pretty good about his being reelected in 1964, John F. Kennedy not only determined that he was going to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces, but he was going to withdraw American troops from Southeast Asia, from Vietnam. Now, a question we need to ask ourselves is this: who wanted us in South Vietnam? Who was making large amounts of money? Whose desire was it for us to go to South Vietnam in the first place? In Avril Manhattan's book, and by the way, Avril Manhattan was a British journalist who worked for decades for the British Broadcasting Company, the BBC. And Avril Manhattan wrote many books on the Vatican and their role in politics. In Avril Manhattan's book entitled Vietnam, Why Did We Go?, Avril Manhattan makes it very clear that the United States got involved in Vietnam because the Roman Catholic Church wanted to start and have a Catholic power in Southeast Asia. And from that base, the Vatican would then seek to take over all of Southeast Asia for Rome. And the primary goal and purpose for taking over that area, of course, number one, to make that whole area Roman Catholic and to oust the hated Buddhists, but also the Vatican wanted South Vietnam as a base to then take over the rest of Southeast Asia because there were so many drugs that were being grown, so many narcotics that were being produced in Southeast Asia that could continue to bring billions and billions of dollars into the Catholic Church's treasury. Avril Manhattan's book on Vietnam and Why Did We Go is the clearest and best book ever written on the true reason why 58,000 American men and women died in that foreign land. So Fletcher Prouty, in his book on JFK, the CIA, Vietnam, and the attempt to assassinate the president, Fletcher Prouty makes it very clear that the United States had a group that was controlling our government. and they wanted to escalate the war in Southeast Asia. And when John F. Kennedy said that he would stop and begin to withdraw American troops from that land, John F. Kennedy was writing his death warrant. And the one group in all the world that wanted us to stay in Vietnam was the Roman Catholic Church. From another book, it is entitled First-Hand Knowledge, written by a CIA agent by the name of Robert D. Morrow. On page 249 of his book, he states this: at 8:30 a.m. on Saturday, the 24th of November, 1963, the limousine carrying CIA Director John McCone pulled into the White House grounds. McCone was there to brief the president and the slain president's former aide, McGeorge Bundy, who, by the way, was the one responsible for the failure of the Bay of Pigs invasion. He was also there to transact one piece of business prior to becoming involved in all the details entailed in a presidential transition. Now, why did McCone, as CIA director, go to the White House? It says it was for the signing of National Security Memorandum 278, a classified document which immediately reversed John F. Kennedy's decision to de-escalate the war in Vietnam. The effect of Memorandum 278 would give the Central Intelligence Agency carte blanche to proceed with a full-scale war in the Far East, a war that would eventually involve over 500,000 Americans in a life-and-death struggle without the necessity of congressional approval. In effect, the Far East would replace Cuba as the thorn in America's side. It would also create a whole new source of narcotics for the mafia's worldwide markets. Did you see what that said? The day after John F. Kennedy was killed, John McCone, the CIA director, went to the White House, signed Memorandum 278, which reversed John F. Kennedy's plan to withdraw the United States from Southeast Asia. And one of the main reasons why, as this book says by Robert Morrow, First-Hand Knowledge, was so that the drug would continue, because billions and billions of dollars of narcotics were being airplaned out of Southeast Asia to be sent to different parts of this world. And the mafia and the Catholic Church and the CIA were going to be filling their coffers. The other reason why John F. Kennedy was slain, it has to do with this. It has to do with John F. Kennedy's plan to close out the Federal Reserve Bank of the United States. We read in the book by Colonel James Greitz on pages 511 and 512 of his book entitled Called to Serve, Profiles in Conspiracy, from John F. Kennedy to George Bush. And we read this: when Kennedy called for a return of America's currency to the gold standard and the dismantling of the Federal Reserve System, he actually minted non-debt money that does not bear the mark of the Federal Reserve. When he dared to actually exercise the leadership authority granted to him by the U.S. Constitution, Kennedy prepared his own death warrant. It was time for him to go. Now you remember in our previous tape together on the Titanic, you remember that right around 1909, 1910, there were men, very wealthy men, that gathered together at Jekyll Island, just off the coast of Georgia, and they met there to plan the establishment of the Federal Reserve Bank here in the United States. And that Federal Reserve Bank was set up so that there would be plenty of money for the Catholic Church to use to pay for the weapons that would be needed during World Wars I and II. Now, the idea of the Federal Reserve Bank was not a new one. Men throughout United States history had attempted to get a Federal Reserve Bank. If you remember from history, in the 1830s, Andrew Jackson went head-to-head with a United States banker by the name of Nicholas Biddle. Nicholas Biddle was controlled by the Rothschild dynasty in Europe. The Rothschilds, of course, were the financial kingpins of Europe for centuries. And so Nicholas Biddle, under the power of the European Rothschilds, sought to set up a central federal bank in the United States. Andrew Jackson went head-to-head with him, and in time Andrew Jackson won and stopped the Federal Reserve Bank. But the European bankers, wanting to control the finances of the United States and to control America through finance, continued to work at establishing a central bank, and they finally got their wish right around 1912 when the Federal Reserve Bank came into being. It was the goal of the Catholic Church and the Jesuit order, the military arm of the Catholic Church, to use this Federal Reserve Bank from the United States to finance the two world wars, World War I and World War II. All of this you can find clearly outlined in the book called The Creature at Jekyll Island. So there were three things then that John F. Kennedy determined to do. Number one, he would shut down, he would break into 1,000 pieces the CIA. Number two, he would stop the war in Vietnam. And number three, he was going to stop and close the Federal Reserve Bank. Now, it's very, very clear in history that the Jesuit order, the military arm of the Catholic Church, they wanted the Vietnam War to be set up so that they could get all the wealth out of there and establish a Catholic world power in Southeast Asia, so that they could drive out at their hated nemesis there, the Buddhists. Number two, we see John F. Kennedy wanting to abolish the Federal Reserve Bank, which had been set up by the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church in order to fund their wars in the world. And number three, we see John F. Kennedy wanting to smash the CIA into 1,000 pieces once he would be reelected. And it's very, very clear in many books that the CIA, from its very inception, once it took over for the OSS, which was the operation, I believe, of the Secret Service. It was started by Wild Bill Donovan after World War II. The CIA has been controlled from the very beginning by the Roman Catholic Church. So we find that all three of these things, the CIA, the Federal Reserve Bank, and the Vietnam War, were three things that John F. Kennedy was going to go after that were little treasures in the arms of Rome. And Rome would not allow John F. Kennedy, their darling Catholic son, to do any of these things. But you say, wait a minute. You just stated that John F. Kennedy was a Roman Catholic. He was the only Catholic president we've ever had. That's exactly right. But we find a very interesting comment from the secret instructions of the Jesuit order, written by their founder, a man by the name of Ignatius Loyola. This statement comes from on page 47 of his book. Loyola says, "Finally, let all with such artfulness gain the ascendant over princes, noblemen, and the magistrates of every place, that they may be ready at our beck and call, even to sacrifice their nearest relatives and most intimate friends, when we say it is for our interest and our advantage." So what is Ignatius Loyola simply saying? If the Jesuit order says that a person is to die, it doesn't matter if that is your best friend, if that is your father, your brother, they are to be killed. Now what a dastardly, evil, and wicked system we find with the Jesuit order of the Roman Catholic Church. How great, you may be saying at this point, boy, you're really making the Catholic Church out to be some powerful entity in the earth. How powerful was the Catholic Church back in the time of the assassination of John F. Kennedy? Reading from a book entitled Murder in the Vatican, written by Avro Manhattan, I'm going to be reading from pages 35 and 36, and also page 271 in his book. Manhattan declares, Francis Cardinal Spellman, the Cardinal of New York at that time, he was the military vicar of the American Armed Forces in Vietnam. He was also the unofficial link between the Pope and John Foster Dulles, the U.S. Secretary of State, whose son Avery Dulles is a Jesuit, and therefore the Secretary's brother Alan, who was the head of the CIA. So through Cardinal Francis Spellman, the Roman Catholic Church had access to and control over John Foster Dulles, the Secretary of State, and also John Foster Dulles's brother, Alan, who was the head of the Central Intelligence Agency. Those two powers, along with the FBI, were in the hands of Cardinal Francis Spellman, the head cardinal of the Catholic Church of New York. As we concluded side one, we saw how powerful the Catholic Church was in the United States government. They had a Catholic president. They had a man who was a Roman Catholic who was the Secretary of State. The Secretary of State's brother was Alan Dulles. He was also a Roman Catholic. And all of these men took orders and made decisions through the advice and counsel of Cardinal Francis Spellman. And as long as they all worked with Francis Spellman, everything was fine. But when John F. Kennedy decided that he was going to crack the CIA, close the Federal Reserve Bank, and withdraw American troops from Vietnam, John F. Kennedy had written his own death warrant. Now, there's some very strange things that surround the assassination of John F. Kennedy, and I'd like to share some of those with you right now. Some inconsistencies and some unanswerable questions that have never been answered, let alone by the Warren Commission, but by anybody else in high positions in the United States government cover-up. I'm going to be reading now from a book entitled John F. Kennedy, The Last Dissenting Witness. It was written by a lady by the name of Jean Hill. And if any of you have ever seen the Abraham Zapruder film that revealed what happened in downtown Dallas, November 22, 1963, you will notice clearly that on a little grassy area, like a little grassy island near where the president was moving in his motorcade, there was a woman in a bright red dress, in a bright red coat, excuse me. That woman's name was Jean Hill. And Jean Hill wrote a book entitled JFK, The Last Dissenting Witness. I'm going to be reading from pages 112 and 113. Jean Hill is having a conversation with a friend of hers by the name of J.B. J.B. was a very intimate friend of Jean Hill. This is what J.B. has to say, and J.B., by the way, was a patrolman, a Dallas patrolman that was assigned to the motorcade as John F. Kennedy came through Dallas. This is what J.B. said, page 113. While Kennedy was busy shaking hands with all the well-wishers at the airport, Johnson's Secret Service people came over to the motorcycle cops and gave us a bunch of instructions. The damnedest thing was they told us the parade route through Dealey Plaza was being changed. Changed? How? Jean Hill asks. It was originally supposed to go straight down Main Street, J.B. said. But they said for us to disregard that. Instead, we were told to make the little jog on Houston and cut over to Elm. Jean Hill's mouth drops open. If you'd stayed on Main Street, Kennedy might have been completely out of range of whoever was shooting at him. My shooter behind the wooden fence definitely wouldn't have had much chance to hit him from there. J.B. stared at her with a straight face. Maybe that's why they changed the route, he said bluntly. But that's not all. They also ordered us into the craziest escort formation I've ever seen. Usually you bracket the car with 4 motorcycles, 1 on each fender. But this time they told the 4 of us assigned to the president's car there'd be no forward escorts. We were to stay well to the back and not let ourselves get ahead of the car's rear wheels under any circumstances. I'd never heard of a formation like that, much less ridden in one, but they said they wanted to let the crowds have an unrestricted view of the president. Well, I guess somebody got an unrestricted view of him, all right. Are you sure it was Lyndon Johnson's Secret Service that told you all this? So at the airport, when John F. Kennedy arrived, the motorcade route through Dallas was changed. And the reason given was so that the people would have an excellent view of the President of the United States. Something else that's rather peculiar. The same book by Jean Hill, page 112. JFK, the last dissenting witness. This is JB once again. According to the guys who were escorting his car in the motorcade, our new president, Lyndon Johnson, is either one jumpy guy or he knows something he's not telling about the Kennedy thing, JB had drawled. What are you talking about? Gene asked innocently. I don't understand. My friends in the motorcade say he started ducking down in the car a good 30 or 40 seconds before the first shots were fired. I'd say that's just a little peculiar, wouldn't you? Aw, come on, JB, Gene Hill said, thinking he had to be joking. They obviously weren't serious, were they? As far as I know, they were dead serious, JB said. One of them told McGuire he saw Johnson duck down even before the car turned onto Houston Street. And he sure as blank wasn't laughing when he said it. Well, maybe Johnson just dropped something in the floor and bent over to pick it up. I mean, there could be a simple explanation. Maybe so, JB said. I don't claim to know what his reasons were, but this guy said it sure looked like he was expecting bullets to be flying. When I heard it, it made me start wondering about a whole lot of other stuff, too. That is taken once again from JFK, the last dissenting witness, Gene Hill. Now, how about the shooters? We read from a book by Howard Donahue, written in 1991. He is an American ballistics expert. He wrote the book entitled Mortal Error. And we're going to be reading from his book on page 108. Mortal Error, the shot that killed JFK. Howard Donahue says this: did Secret Service agent Hickey do it? He knew Hickey was seen with an AR-15 the instant the final shot hit home. Finally, he knew the bullet's trajectory led straight to Hickey and his gun. The bullet that hit Kennedy in the head, in the back, came from the left rear, from the follow-up car, from the AR-15. Now that's according to Howard Donahue, an American ballistics expert, writing the book Mortal Error in 1991. Another man, a Swiss historian by the name of Jan van Helsing, who wrote a book called Secret Societies and Their Power in the 20th Century, written in 1995 on pages 230 and 231, we read these words. John F. Kennedy was murdered at Dallas, November 22, 1963. The killing shot came from the driver of the president's limousine, a CIA agent who shot Kennedy in the head with a special weapon developed by the CIA. If you look at the original Zapruder film of the assassination in slow motion and watch the driver, then you can clearly see that he turns around with a gun in his hand, shoots, and the back of Kennedy's head bursts. Now, when I first read that, I thought, wait a minute. If Kennedy was shot from the front by the man driving his car, a CIA agent, why did the back of Kennedy's head blow out and off? This is what Van Helsing declares. The films shown in most Western countries have the driver cut out. The bullet, too, was a CIA special that only exploded after entering the body. and thus annihilated Kennedy's brain. Okay. So we read here that there were people that shot at Kennedy from behind, from the left, CIA agent Hickey, and also the driver of Kennedy's limousine, turning and shooting from the front. John F. Kennedy was rushed to Parkman Memorial Hospital in downtown Dallas. Texas law prohibits people that died in the state of Texas to be removed without an autopsy. We read, and I've read in different documents, that at gunpoint, the leading doctors at Parkman Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas, at gunpoint they were held as the body of John F. Kennedy was removed from that hospital without an autopsy. Why? Why didn't they want an autopsy done on John F. Kennedy? Was there too much evidence that there was many more than the single bullet theory of the Warren Commission? Were there many bullets that the doctors would have found that would have shattered the idea that Lee Harvey Oswald was the lone gunman? Is that why an autopsy was not allowed in Texas? Is that why Kennedy's body was then shipped to Washington, D.C., where a federal autopsy could be made, where they could fabricate the evidence to support the theory that the Warren Commission would come up with? The vehicle that John F. Kennedy was riding in? It's very, very fascinating. From a book written, John F. Kennedy, Conspiracy of Silence, we read these astounding words. The book was written by a Charles A. Crenshaw, and we're reading on page 106. JFK, Conspiracy of Silence. 3 days after the assassination, Carl Renas, head of security for the Dearborn Division of the Ford Motor Company, drives the presidential limousine, helicopters hovering overhead from Washington to Cincinnati. In doing so, he noted several bullet holes, the most notable being the one in the windshield's chrome molding strip, which he said was clearly a primary strike and not a fragment. The limousine was taken by Renas to Hess and Eisenhart of Cincinnati, where the chrome molding was replaced. The Secret Service told Renas to keep your mouth shut. This man who drove the limousine to Cincinnati was the head of security for the Dearborn Division of Ford Motor Company. Who was the head of the Dearborn Division of the Ford Motor Company in 1963 that dispatched Renas for the task of his life? According to a man by the name of Robert Lacey, in his book entitled Ford, The Men and the Machine, page 531, we read these words. Henry Ford II says today that the first time he can remember meeting Lee Iacocca was in November 1960, when he summoned the young salesman to his office to tell him he was giving him command of the Ford Division at Dearborn, Michigan. Lee Iacocca was the man in charge of the Dearborn division of the Ford Motor Company who dispatched Carl Renus to go to Washington, D.C. to get the limousine that John F. Kennedy was driving in and to bring it to Cincinnati so that it could be fixed, so that the chrome molding was replaced. That would tell us that not only did Carl Renus understand that there was more than one bullet that killed John F. Kennedy, there was another man as well, and his name was Lee Iacocca. And what was Lee Iacocca's religious background? Well, let me read to you from Lee Iacocca's own book called Iacocca, an Autobiography, page 8. Iacocca says this: "It took me a number of years to fully understand why I had to make a good confession to a priest before I went to Holy Communion, but in my teens I began to appreciate the importance of this most misunderstood rite of the Catholic Church. In later years I found myself completely refreshed after confession. I even began to attend weekend retreats where the Jesuits, in face-to-face examinations of conscience, made me come to grips with how I was conducting my life." Lee Iacocca, Roman Catholic E. Iacocca, head of the Dearborn division of the Ford Motor Company. He was the one who dispatched Carl Renus to get the limousine that had the evidence of multiple bullets that were shot from multiple guns that killed John F. Kennedy. Isn't it amazing that many, many years later, Lee Iacocca, as I believe it was the Chrysler company that was about ready to collapse, Lee Iacocca was the president, and he went to Congress and he said, "Please give us some help financially." And Lee Iacocca was helped by a fellow Catholic so that he was able to bring Chrysler out of terrible, terrible debt. The man who helped Lee Iacocca was fellow Roman Catholic Speaker of the House, Thomas Tip O'Neill. I went on the internet recently to find out more about the assassination of various people who were involved and understood about the events that transpired around the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And I came up with 7 pages of people that died within 13 years of John F. Kennedy's death. 7 pages of people who knew something about the assassination. And most of them died of gunshots, wounds in the head. Some died in plane crashes that were mysterious. Others had their throats cut. Just terrible, awful things that happened to so many people who knew something about the assassination. In a book by Jim Marrs called Crossfire, The Plot That Killed Kennedy, he stated this: "In the 3-year period which followed the murder of President Kennedy and Lee Harvey Oswald, 18 material witnesses died, 6 by gunfire, 3 in motor accidents, 2 by suicide, 1 from a cut throat, 1 from a karate chop to the neck, 5 from natural causes. a mathematician hired by the London Sunday Times in February of 1967, concluded that the odds of the number of witnesses involved in the assassination of John F. Kennedy dying between November 22, 1963 and that date were 100,000 trillion to 1. In the time period ranging from November 22, 1963 to August 1993, over 115 witnesses have died or fallen victim to death by strange circumstances, suicides, or murder. Now, friends, I've done just a little bit of research on the Jesuit order, the military arm of the Roman Catholic Church. And if you get in the way of their program, you might as well call it quits. Henry IV tried it in France. 12 years later, he was killed. Abraham Lincoln tried it in 1856, and 9 years later, he was killed. William Henry Harrison tried it in 1840, and a month later, he was dead. Queen Elizabeth tried it in England, and the Roman Catholic Church tried to kill Queen Elizabeth at least a dozen times between 1558 and 1588. When every one of their attempts failed, the Catholic Church sent the Spanish Armada under Philip II to try to destroy Protestant England. John F. Kennedy dared to stand up to his church, and he likewise was killed. Assassinated by the Jesuit arm of the Catholic Church, November 22, 1963. And all the rest of these people who witnessed or knew something of the assassination were also killed. The famous English Prime Minister during World War II by the name of Winston Churchill once said this: "Most men occasionally stumble over the truth, but they pick themselves up and continue as if nothing had happened." I believe with all my heart that the documentation and the evidence that has been presented in this tape is the absolute truth concerning the assassination of John F. Kennedy. What will you do with it? Will you stumble over it and get up and go on with your life as if nothing happened? Will you continue to live a life as though to say to the loving God of heaven that looks down upon each one of us in mercy, will we continue to live our lives as though He does not exist? Or will we begin to understand that there is a great controversy going on over each one of our lives? There is a sinister, evil, devilish power in the world today. And I'm talking about the Jesuit order of the Catholic Church. I'm talking about the Catholic Church and their involvement in the destruction of millions of people in order to carry on their program. Knowing that there is an antichrist power in the earth today, the Catholic Church, we can also know today that there is the true Christ, the Lord Jesus, who went to Calvary's cross that He might die in our place, that He might bring within our reach the hope of everlasting life. But you know what? I don't ask you today to accept Jesus because you might die tonight, but I ask you to accept Him now because you have to live tomorrow. What a life we can have of peace, forgiveness, conscious innocence before the God of heaven, if we will embrace Christ as our Savior and our friend. We've come upon the truth. Will we pick up ourselves and go on as if nothing has happened? Or will we embrace the truth and allow it to set us free?